So I always start this off by making a kind of a controversial statement, and that is that no society is as widespread as African society. So we've been talking about Japanese, we've talked about the Chinese, we've been talking about European cultures, the Romans, the Greeks, the English, and we're talking about how widespread those societies get as they start to explore the world and as they start to trade with each other. But no society makes it as far and infiltrates as deep into every other society as the civilizations in Africa do. What do you think about that statement? Do you think that's logical?
Say again. What was it?
That the civilization that reaches the furthest and goes the most distance and involved and is most mixed up with all the other civilizations is African civilizations. Why would that be? Anybody want to venture a guess?
Because it's the oldest.
Is arguably, yeah, it's one of the origins of human life, but the civilizations that formed in Africa aren't the surviving ones aren't nearly as old as some of the ones in the Mesopotamian.
Because it might have been easier to get on a boat and trade with them.
Okay, that's a good theory.
They didn't
Okay.
have the natural it's something like some of the other areas did.
Okay, well, let's look at what they did have. Let's just take a look at African society. Okay, so one of the things that I have to say right up front is it's always really tempting to say, like I just said, let's look at African society as though there's anything about African society that is one big thing. It's not one big thing. Africa is a huge continent with all different kinds of life and all different kinds of civilizations that formed on it because it's climate-wise, it's incredibly diverse. And the people that developed as a result of that are incredibly diverse. So I want to just disclaimer right off the top. There is no such thing as African civilization by itself. There's no big blanket umbrella thing that is Africa, except the continent itself. Everything else is broken up into all different kinds of civilizations. So I'm going to make some big generalizations about Africa, and I don't want you to miss that point that there is a huge difference between the civilization that formed up here and a civilization that formed down here, between a civilization that formed right along the Mediterranean and a civilization that formed on the tip of South Africa. They're completely different worlds. But there are some things that they have in common, and the reason they have them in common is because everybody has them in common. For example, across Africa, you will find examples of holistic healing, okay? The idea that your body, your spirit, your mental state, and your position in society are all tied up together. That you can't be healthy if your relationship with your neighbors is not healthy. That you can't be healthy in your body if your spirit is not healthy. That's an idea that goes throughout all of many, many African civilizations. That idea that everything is holistic. Ancestral veneration is something that we see across the spectrum in African civilizations. How they venerate their ancestors is different, but the fact that they do tie themselves to the past, get inspired by the past, feel responsible to the past, to the ancestors before them, that's something that you find across all of many African cultures. They follow the very predictable pattern of how to form a civilization that we've already talked about. They start as strong families, which then form strong clans, which then form trading villages with each other, and then establish sacred centers, which creates trade empires. The same way that happened in the Mesopotamian and in the Mediterranean and in China and Japan. They follow that same pattern, but they hold on to this idea of holistic life and ancestral veneration as they do it, which makes them just a little bit different in the way that their cities form. So we start by talking about their religions begins as animistic, as many religions do, but very quickly you start to see the influx of religions from the Mediterranean. One of the earliest religions that comes in is Christianity. The disciples, I guess, of Christianity traveled around the Mediterranean and into down the Nile and into Egypt. And you can even find that if you look in the book of Acts, you can find an example of an Ethiopian eunuch being converted by one of the earliest disciples and then carrying that back to his people. So this religion is called Coptic Christianity. Okay. When not the Ottoman, but when the Islamic empires began to spread in the early days of Muhammad, they spread across the northern Mediterranean and then traded south. So you begin to see very early examples of Islamic religion around these coastal areas. When the trade empires began to trade up with the Mediterranean, the more animistic tribes began to move south. And so you find a large pool of what's called the Bantu, who practice this very kind of hardcore animistic ancestral worship spirituality that breaks itself into all different kinds of things because it's tribal. So, but from the very earliest days of the, CE, you start to see splits in religions all across Africa. Coptic Christianity was established by Mark, and I put that in quotes, by probably the scribe who wrote the Gospel of Mark in Egypt, and it spread along the Nile River basin. One of the things about Coptic Christianity is that it takes that animism and that ancestral worship and works it in. So the flavor of Coptic Christianity is very different from what you'll find in, say, Roman Christianity, because they bring music and rhythm and holistic living, the idea of body healing also being as important as, and body purity also being as important as, spiritual purity, and they tie that all together. So the Coptic Christians who practice today, if you are a practicing Christian who went to a 10-day service being held by Coptic Christians, you might not recognize what's happening. But it's arguably one of the oldest flavors of Christianity in the world is Coptic Christianity. When Islam spread, it was the Sunni that spread it. So if you remember, the Shiites were more strict, were more militaristic, but the Sunni tended to work more with local governmental systems, and so they managed to spread further. So it's mostly Sunni Islam that spreads into Africa. They also maintain a very strong ancestral tradition. They also incorporate that. And how that expresses itself in Islam is the leaders of an Islamic community are usually the governmental leaders, the caliphates, but they're also the teachers. So the veneration of the ancestors being, the family, the patriarch of a family of teachers makes you a stronger line of teachers. So they have more veneration for teachers as a result of tying in that African ancestral stuff. But Africa has its own empires. Very early on, it begins to have its own empires. Now, we define an empire by saying, if you take a series of clans and they make villages, and then those villages trade together, and then those trading villages form little, tall building trading centers, and then you can tie all those trading centers together and hold power over them, then you're an empire. But when we're talking about African empires, we're talking about sophisticated empires. So who was it that said they didn't have the resources available to them? So they were more dependent on other resources. Was that you, Chris?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I want to just dispense with that right now. The empires in Africa were probably every bit as impressive as, in some cases more so, as the empires that formed in the Mesopotamian and in the Hellenistic Empire. These were widespread, very sophisticated, and the empires of the Mediterranean were dependent on some of them for some of the things that they had. So no, that's not it. Sorry, Chris. So let's talk about a couple of those empires. Let's start with the Mali. Okay, the Mali Empire formed on the Niger River, okay? Control of this river. Now remember I'll come back to that in a minute, but I'll remember that the landscape of Africa, there's a huge desert here, okay? And then this is, this valley here is only fertile because of the influx of the rivers. So if you control the rivers, then you can pull products from the south of that desert and trade them north. So being able to control the rivers with a military force was a big part of the formation of this empire. some of the products that they had to trade were gold. The empires of the Mediterranean, you'll remember, were starting to coin money, and you can coin money using gold dust. But in certain parts of Africa, gold nuggets are really aren't that hard to find. So they would trade gold nuggets to the royalty of the Mediterraneans. They'd trade gold dust to the Mediterranean cultures to be mined and to be coined into coins, which then would be used by everybody in the Roman empires. So one of the most valuable things that they had to trade was gold. The single most valuable thing that they had to trade was salt. Salt is incredibly valuable throughout China, throughout Europe, throughout everywhere around the Mediterranean. Salt is incredibly valuable. Every society needs salt. You can't preserve food without salt. And in a lot of places, how do we get salt? If you don't have a salt mine, does anybody know how you get salt?
Salt water.
From the ocean.
Right. You have to sift it. You have to strain it. And the salt that you get from that is corrosive. It's like, it's not as good. It's not as pure. So the fact that Africa, especially right around the Niger River, had salt mines available to them meant that they could literally make bricks of salt and caravan them to trade. So the single most valuable export coming out of Mali was salt.
Hey,
But
Mindy.
they did. Yes.
Yeah, the Romans paid their soldiers in salt, and that's where the term salary comes from.
That's true. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's true. I don't have that in my notes, but I knew that, so it probably should be. Yeah, that's true. And actually, you know that places are valuable for their access to salt because, like, English villages are named for their ability to have salt. I can't remember exactly what it is. There's a thing that you see on the end of, what is it? Do you remember? Which, yeah. So Greenwich, Eastwich, Norwich, Sandwich, any of those means that there is there's access to salt in that village. So they named it after the fact that it was possible to find salt there. So it's incredibly valuable up in Europe too.
Hi, David.
Yeah, David's sitting here.
What's up, Chris?
So the other resource that these African empires traded was manpower, and in the form of slaves. So we're going to talk for a second, are we? Yeah, we're going to talk about the nature of slavery because I think that a lot of it gets lost in the cultural history. So we want to make sure to be really clear about this. Owning slaves is a sign of wealth. So the ownership of slaves is a sign of how wealthy you were within the African society. The more wealthy you were, the more slaves you had. And you could transfer that wealth by selling your slave contract of somebody to somebody else. So you could transfer wealth by transferring slaves. So let's talk about how people become slaves. Slavery is a part of a justice system in early African cultures, okay? And the reason that I want to make that clear is because I want to differentiate between slavery in Africa and the way that it spreads through these early civilizations and the way slavery takes on a completely different system in order to accommodate American slavery. So I want to differentiate between these two things because I hear it a lot. Don't you guys hear it a lot where people say, well, my people were enslaved once too.
But it wasn't Chinese slavery.
Right. I mean, you know, I'm Anglo-Saxon and the Anglo-Saxons were slaves to the Normans, but it's not the same thing. And I want to explain why. In early African culture, slavery was part of a justice system. You became a slave if you had a debt you couldn't pay, then you worked it off as a slave. You became enslaved because of criminal punishment. It was you didn't just get thrown in prison, you got enslaved so that you could work off your sentence. And you became enslaved if you and another village went to war with each other and you lost, and you became a prisoner of war. And in each of these instances, this is a system that everybody agrees on. You know that in your life, if you engage in these activities, there's a possibility you might end up enslaved to somebody else. If you go into debt and you can't pay it off, then you might end up somebody's slave. If your village and another village can't make peace and you fight with each other, there's a possibility that you will end up a prisoner of war. And if that's the case, then you will be enslaved. If you commit a crime, this is something that you can possibly look forward to. But this is an agreement between people. And that's what makes the difference. These are people, these are equals. They stand equal with each other as far as, the value of a life. They just all participate in this system that results in some of them ending up as slaves. The contract for your debt can enslave you to somebody, and then your contract can be given like a collector. When I don't know if you know this, but if you go into debt now, a collector can buy your debt from the person you went into debt for, and then they can try to collect the debt from you. And if they never collect it, they can sell it to somebody else, and then that person can collect it. It's the same kind of thing. Your contract can be bought and sold and then you become the slave of somebody else. But everybody participates willingly in this system because it's something that is a possibility. That's as opposed to getting suddenly kidnapped and thrown on a boat and then told that you have to work for the rest of your life as somebody who doesn't even rank as a human, which is how American slavery is different. We'll cover that when we get to it. Okay, so the 3 early West African kingdoms from 500 to 600 CE all kind of center on this Niger River complex here. It starts with the Empire of Mali, which is here on the coast and right at the crux of the Senegal and the Niger. The Empire of Mali is prosperous because it trades products between these rainforests that are down here and the Muslim caliphates that are coming in up here, because it's right, like the spread of Islam is around 600 to 800, and this is like 400 years later. So they're well established across Northern Africa, and the Kingdom of Mali uses this river to trade products from south of this river to the north of the Mediterranean. So they become rich trading with the Muslims, basically. They have a native resources, so they have things that they have locally. They also have a heavy tax on anything that passes through them, which is everything that comes from down here and goes up there has to pass through this area. And then they also have a acquisition and resell industry that's very, very powerful. For a long time, the Songhai Empire was a tributary of Mali. They were positioned so that they provided tribute, but eventually they took over this crux city here, which was Timbuktu. And when they did, they choked all of the trade coming up the Niger River in both directions and made it so that the Muslims coming from this way had to trade with Timbuktu. And that gave them power over the Mali. The Songhai were largely Muslim people. So the Mali Empire, which was, animistic African, is basically taken over by the Songhai Empire, which is Muslim. Okay, so, and then that's really who exists when we start to get into like the 1500s and 1600s, is really the remnants of the Songhai at Timbuktu. Over on the other side of Africa, Ethiopia is it's not Ethiopia, it's Abyssinia, but the tribal peoples that lived up and down this area of the Upper Nile, receive support from the Muslims and begin to rise up and form themselves into what's called the city of Aksum. A tribal person raised an army and then received support from the Ottoman Empire so that he could become a coastal trading power, which would then trade with the Ottoman Empire. So I don't know, it's sort of like when we empower a local to rise up and take control with the understanding that they're going to be nice to us afterwards. It's kind of the same thing. And that is a long, Ethiopia or Abyssinia, that is a long-lasting empire, almost 500 years. I'm sorry, 700 years. Throat's getting dry. On the West Coast, the Congo establishes with a large palace at Mbanzu. Most of their power comes from trading up with Mali and with the Songhai, but eventually the Portuguese sail around Africa and land here, and the Congo becomes the ally of the Portuguese. It becomes one of the stopping places of the Portuguese. Here's a nice picture of Mbanza. Is it Mbanza or Mbanzu? It's Mamanza. I have it differently in my notes. And then in the south, all of these tribal people who moved from this area into the south to escape from the power of these, Muslim empires brought their tribal traditions with them and formed a complex that's not an empire, because they're all just nomadic tribal people. There is a commonality of language. They speak Bantu. They build a sacred trade center in Zimbabwe, but that trade center never exceeds more than 10,000 people, and it falls apart and is a ruin by the time the Portuguese get there. So they never really established a trading empire in the South. It's mostly just disorganized tribal villages. So Henry the Navigator begins to explore as a result of, the Renaissance, really. Henry the Navigator begins to explore Portugal. He is the younger brother of the Portuguese king, and he wants to make a name for himself separate from his brother. So he begins to establish trading posts around the coast of Africa. He hits many locations around the coast, and then other explorers come behind him and do the same thing. One of the first things they discover, of course, is the wealth of resources. And one of the things they discover very quickly is the tendency of chieftains, especially in the Congo, to trade their slave contracts for wealth. So they come with weapons that the Congolese nobility doesn't have. And in exchange for those weapons, they receive slaves, which then they take back to Europe. And we begin to see the incorporation of household and field slaves into the economy of Portugal, which is going to matter because pretty soon Portugal is going to send explorers west, and when they do, they will take slaves with them. This is all kind of based on the idea of mercantilism. The Portuguese use of slavery as they explore. And I guess normally I would have done my colonialism lecture before this. So I'll just say, let's skip ahead and take a look at how slaves end up in the colonies. One of the things you have to understand is that the European powers that are colonizing the Americas are doing so in a mercantile system. And mercantilism is messy. This is what it's supposed to look like. The mother country has colonies, and each of those colonies has a resource, and those colonies hand their resource over to the mother country. Yay for the mother country, it gets rich. Except the price of maintaining that, because if you take a colony that used to grow a lot of different things and make them only grow one thing, that means you have to provide them with everything that they're lacking, and you have to buy everything that they make. So for example, if this is Virginia and all they make is tobacco, then you have to provide them with everything that is not tobacco that they need. And you have to buy all of the tobacco they make and find a way to sell it as the mother country. So mercantilism is really expensive. Any way that you can cut down on the cost of overhead for mercantilism helps. So cash crops are incredibly important in a mercantile system. You need for colonies to produce those crops that are the most valuable. So even though, for example, Jamaica has a multitude of things that will grow because they are rich, and they are a rich environment for sugarcane, that's what you want to grow there. Indigo, for example, is a plant that grew in Central and Northern South America, and a little bit South North America, like all that whole equatorial system there. Indigo is a plant that is incredibly valuable in Europe because it makes a dye that becomes fashionable. So you want whole colonies growing indigo. And the turnover in these cash crops is very high. The life expectancy of a slave who ends up in a sugar plantation is probably about 6 years, because it's an extremely dangerous crop to deal with and process. Sugarcane is. And diving for pearls, the same thing. The life expectancy is very short, so you need more and more and more and more slaves. So what happens is that these cash crop colonies rely on slaves, which they get from, for example, Congo. And then they go back to Congo and they say, hey, we were running out because they're dying, we need more. And suddenly a king who had 200 slaves indebted to him, but traded them all, suddenly needs more slaves to trade. And so this begins this breakdown of the justice system of slavery in Africa. Demand exceeds supply, and suddenly African kings on the coast are pressuring others to go and find more slaves, raid villages, declare war where there wasn't war, create indebtedness or crime where there wasn't indebtedness or crime, or just kidnap them. And eventually that's what happens. Eventually they become just kidnapped. When that happens, they lose their status as equal people. The first English colonial slaves come to Jamestown. The English and French interrupted the movement of slaves to Portugal. Either they bought or they pirated them, and then interacted with the settlement at Jamestown in 1619, and then traded those slaves with the English, who then went, this is cool, and began to negotiate their own contracts with the African coastline. So now you have the English also saying, hey, we need slaves. And the African kings going, well, we'll see what we can do. We don't have anybody else indebted to us, so I guess we'll start kidnapping. And that's, I'm really oversimplifying it, but y'all are following this, right? You understand that what I'm saying is that there was a shift from a justice system to a supply and demand system. And in order to make peace with that, the nature of the person who was a slave changed. It changed from somebody who was participating in a system that they'd always been a part of to somebody who could be just kidnapped off the street and kidnapped out of their hut, actually, out of their village, and then just sold. And there was necessarily no end in sight. Now, the slavery in Jamestown, one important thing to say about that is that the slavery in Jamestown was manumission slavery, which means that originally the slaves that were brought were supposed to be able to work their way out of slavery, and their children were not supposed to be born slaves. So the very first generation of children born to the slaves in Jamestown were not actually slaves themselves. And then just to make sure that that never happened again, the laws were rewritten so that children born to slaves became slaves. But originally, when they were first sold, that wasn't what how their contract read. So manumission was something that was possible at first, and then it was very quickly done away with. As a result of that
Say,
traffic,
Mindy?
yes.
Mindy, when did England abolish slavery? It wasn't like 1810 or something like that.
Yeah, and interestingly, when England abolished slavery, they abolished it in all of their colonies, and they compensated the slave owners. So the loss of income and the loss of property value, the crown actually compensated the slave owners for that. So the transition from being allowed to own slaves to not being allowed to own them was much smoother for the English than it was for the Americans, because their slaves weren't just freed, the slave owners were compensated. So yeah, and I think it was 1817, something like that, that it became official, but I'd have to look. It's in another set of notes. I know it was long enough before the Civil War that by the time the Civil War got there, the Civil War in America got there, the English were like, what are you doing, you know?
So they were compensated for losing their slaves, but the slaves never was compensated for being taken from their country.
That's correct. But what happened as a result of that is that in most British countries where there are African descendants, there's very little resentment between the races. So I guess what happens if you compensate a slave owner for the loss of his slaves is that he can afford to turn around and offer them jobs. So he keeps their labor, but he has to pay them for it, but that's okay because he got compensated. So he can afford to hire the labor with the compensation that he received. So there's very little, there's a nice smooth transition of ownership from the slave owner to the slave themselves of their personal life. And there's money moving around so that if, for example, if you go to London today, there are lots of different races living in the city of London, and there's not as much racial tension between the races in London as there was in America, as there still is in America, as a result of the fact that when slavery stopped in America, it was hiccupy and full of resentment and had to be enforced by the law. And it was, you know, it's messy. So I want you to take a look at this picture just to get a grasp of the sheer numbers of people that moved from the West African coast over into the Americas. We've got basically 5, okay, so 5 million from West Central Africa that moved over here, and almost 3 million of them moved into these islands. And this is where the cash crops were with the highest rate of early death. So they're not moving here and then having generations of children. They're moving here and dying. The very much smaller 210,000 that moved into southern United States to work in cash crop colonies there had a much longer life expectancy and had generations of children. But the gross majority of the slaves moved into South America and Central America. But if this map was accurate, it would also show you that slaves also went this way, not as a part of this slave trade, but as a part of early trades with the Muslims between the emperor of the Songhai Empire. Slaves also went this way. So slaves were carried by their Muslim masters into the Silk Road in China. Slaves were carried into the Mesopotamian. Slaves were carried all the way over. And actually, if you'll remember, during the Mongol Empire, an African slave owned by a Muslim master outranked the Chinese in the Yuan Empire in China, in the Mongolian Empire in China. So the sheer number of African inhabitants who were moved out of Africa and into other parts of the world is humongous. It's explosive. Over time, the African culture infiltrated everywhere. As part of the slave trade, because of that supply and demand issue, because they abandoned the justice system entirely, when they were enslaved, people from Africa were stripped of their identity. They were transported as though they were cattle, not as though they were people. And in some ways, they were protected as an investment, not as people, but protected because they wanted them to survive. So they did their best to keep as many of them alive as possible. But the same way you would keep most of your herd alive. And then they were bought and sold without any reference to themselves or any reference to their own past or their own actions. The next series of pictures in this PowerPoint are troubling. I just want to give you a heads up that that's a thing that's about to happen. Having been stripped of their identity and identified as cattle instead of people allowed for a level of treatment that is what American slavery is now famous for. Branding, just like cattle, punishment, whipping, the enslavement of children, which was something that happened with prisoners of war and occasionally with indebtedness, but there was always a time limit on that. But just the capture and enslavement of children for a life of slavery. Transporting across the grounds in coffles, which is a coffle is a line of slaves tied together, bound together anyway, one way or another, driven again like herd animals instead of like people. And then how they were shipped across the Atlantic as the supply grew and grew and grew, the way that they were shipped. At first, slaves were moved in what was called loose packing, which means that you just had a ship and you put as many people as you could comfortably fit in it. But eventually you start to have ships where they lay as many people as they can into as small a space as possible. And they expect to lose about 30% of their slaves en route. So this is, to me, if anything else demonstrates the departure from that justice system, it's this. This is not a way to treat humans. This is a way to treat animals. You know, this is how you transport livestock. This is not how you transport humans. On the African coast were trading fortresses where African authorities would gather slaves that had been brought by those coffles onto the coast to be traded with European powers. Those African slave fortresses were the site of great big deals being made, wholesale purchase of slaves. And it is here that your identity as a member of a certain village is completely lost. You are separated from the people you came with and lumped in with people you didn't. You are lumped together with people whose language you don't speak. And maybe you find your way to one or two other people who do speak the same language you do, and then you're separated when you're purchased. So this is where the first step of that loss of identity takes place. This is a practice that took place on board ships called dancing the slaves, where slaves were brought up from below and then made to dance and exercise so that they could stay in shape, so that they would look more impressive when they were sold on the in the Americas. I'm sorry that I have no choice but to do this part. I get asked the question almost every semester, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't they just jump overboard? Why didn't they try to fight? And I will just say as a blanket statement, so we don't have to get too deeply into the subject, they did try. And for every attempt that was made, there was a solution put in place. Nets surrounded ships so that if you tried to jump overboard, you would get tangled in the nets. And if you didn't drown, you'd just get hauled up and then punished. There was a practice to discourage people from jumping overboard, which was to sacrifice one slave to sharks so that they could see what would happen if they jumped overboard. There were devices that were made to force feed them so they couldn't starve themselves to death. And there were punishments put in place for slaves who did other things while en route that would have maybe given them a chance at ultimate freedom, if not, actual freedom. They did try. This is all part of what's called the triangle trade. Slaves to the Americas would then work the sugar. Sugar would be shipped to the English colonies. The sugar would be made into rum and other goods and then moved over back into Africa. Here's another iteration of the same thing. So this passage here of the triangle trade is called the Middle Passage. The slaves to the Americas is the Middle Passage. So if you ever hear about people talking about the horrors of the Middle Passage, this is what they're talking about. So here are some numbers. I guess we kind of already did this. We're talking about 6 million people in a single century. 6 million people moved out of Africa and into the Americas. 38% of them went to Brazil. The Caribbean islands, 40%, that's where the life expectancy was the highest. And only 6% of them went to British North America. So the people who are descended from the slaves that worked in Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia are actually the smallest percentage of slaves who were brought over from Africa, except for those that went into Europe itself. Here's a better chart that actually shows the slave trade across the Muslim caliphate. So from 1500 to 1870, these African cultures were carried in one way or another to every single continent. And when they went, they brought with them those things. They brought with them that holistic spiritual healing. They brought with them the act of call and response, which did not exist in worship services before that in Europe. So that thing that you do at the beginning of the church service where you say something and then the whole congregation says something and then you say something and the whole congregation, that is due to the African influence in Europe that was brought in during the Renaissance. They brought certain kinds of foods and the ability to turn those foods that were, say, disposable by the higher circles of society and create a new cuisine out of them are something that are incredibly widespread. And they also brought with them their languages, their practices, and their speech patterns. So in almost every culture, you find an influence of African civilization. So I'm stopping my share. How y'all doing? I know that a lot of that is very dark. I guarantee it gets much darker if you're actually taking US history with me, because I actually spend time talking about, we need to understand, that the movement of African civilization across the continents was incredible and it was widespread, and there is no civilization that exists that does not have a seed of African civilization in it. There's no place that I don't want to say that because it's entirely possible that that's not true. You could maybe find someplace but every major civilization that makes it into the modern world, every civilization that you're studying for your world stage project has a seed of that African culture in it, because they were moved as part of this personnel transfer, as part of this slave trade. They were moved into every culture, and they brought with them some things that were incredibly valuable, like the idea of holistic health, the idea that your body suffers when your mind is not right, that your personal health is not good if your society is not healthy. Those ideas, they brought with them the idea of rhythmic prayer, and the influx of music. Now, last week we talked about the Renaissance. We talked about how Europe interacted during the Crusades with the Mediterranean for the first time, and brought back a whole bunch of ancient stuff with them, right? It's interesting to me that at the same time, the idea of worship music also came into Europe. Because in most of the Christian churches, while there was guided chant, the idea of actually singing as part of a choir, as part of worship, was not something that was done in Christian churches in Europe until after the Crusades. And the reason for that is probably because African worship always incorporates music. So the African worship goes up into the Mediterranean and Islamic area. The Crusades come and raid that and bring it up. And suddenly you've got composers writing madrigals for worship. You've got composers actually creating music specifically for worship, which was just unheard of before. It was indulgent and vain. Music was something you did when you wanted to relax. You didn't bring it into the worship, but they do in African cultures. Can you think of any other ways that happened? Any other things that made their way over to into other cultures from these animistic religions? Where else do you see that kind of oh yeah, that makes sense, that kind of influence?
Animistic influence.
Sure.
I want to see if anybody else gets this, because I have
You know they can hear you, right?
well, I can hear me too. So
David would like to contribute. I hope y'all don't mind. What were you going to say? Food? You want to expound?
They brought their cuisine. They brought their dishes, their spices.
Right. The use of spices, the use of certain spices was unheard of in Europe before the Crusades, and then suddenly it was everywhere in Europe. And a part of that was a result of trade with people who had been raised to incorporate spices into things. Food is incredibly bland in Europe. I don't know if y'all think white people food is still bland. I'm not sure if we think that. I'm always surprised to find out that people think that the food I eat is bland, because I'm like, I'm fine with it. And then I had a foster son for a while who was like, we love you, Mindy, but yes, your food is bland. So the idea of food being an exciting thing might be the influence of African civilizations on the Crusades and then on the European civilizations after that.
They traveled the world looking for spices and then realized they didn't like any of them.
Yeah, it's possible. So, okay. So I go back to my original statement, which is no civilization is as widespread and is infiltrated as many other cultures as the civilizations of Africa. And given that that's the case, it's kind of amazing how Eurocentric our history often is. Like the fact that we focus so much on Europe when we're talking about the modern world. It's kind of interesting considering.
It's our bias. I mean,
When Europeans write the history is going to be about Europe.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me talk really quickly. You don't have an assignment this week because you have an exam this week. So you don't have a separate assignment because all I want you to do is focus on the exam, but I do want you to take a look at this document, and it's long. It's probably one of the longest I'm going to give you.
Yeah, I kind of skimmed over it. 22 pages, was it?
22 pages. Yes, oh my gosh. Wait, what did I do?
It's long.
Yes, it is. And it's heavy. Okay, so I want to give you some time on it because I am going to ask, oh, I'm in the wrong class. I'm going to ask you an essay question from that document. So that's one of the reasons why I'm letting you off the hook on having an assignment this week, is because I want you to actually take a look at this document, and you may end up skimming it. And I would not judge you if you did. You need to learn how to skim documents. That's a valuable skill in studying history, how to scan and skim without, reading in depth. But this is John Wesley's Thoughts Upon Slavery. And John Wesley, for those of you that don't know, is the founder of the Methodist Church, which during a period in history that we haven't gotten to yet, swept across England and then into America. And so he had a lot of power over the thoughts of people. Basically, what I want you to do is look for the answer to the question that's going to be in your exam, which is going to be what is it that slave owners say that justifies owning slaves? And how does John Wesley argue with them? And there's probably about 8 or 9 of them, but you'll need to probably find 3. So find the places where somebody puts an argument for why it's okay to own slaves. Furnishing of slaves is necessary for the trade, wealth, and glory of our nation. Here are some mistakes. Wealth is not necessary to the glory of any nation. That would be one example. I'll give you that one for free. But where he takes an argument that slave owners have and he picks it apart and says that's still not an excuse. It's a valuable document, I think, because one of the things that he does is he talks about how those things are different. So like the common misconception of Europeans was when we take slaves out of Africa, we're taking them out of a brutal, unsophisticated jungle, primitive environment and bringing them into our civilized society and giving them something richer. And the way that he argues with that is by pointing out what kind of civilizations actually exist in Africa and how sophisticated they actually are, and how no, we're not actually pulling them out of the jungle and rescuing them from the tigers in order to make them slaves. That's not what's happening here. And so he takes them point by point and does a really good job of it. So find those instances in the document, and then that's going to be one of your essay questions for the exam. The other essay questions are going to be on a document you've already read. So I will post those by 5 p.m. today, and you'll be able to take a look at them and start thinking about what your answer is going to be. No minimum and no maximum on your essay questions, just cover the answer. And wherever possible, prove that you got your answer from the document. So reference the document. I'm not quite as waggy about this as, but I'm also not very Perry about it either. I want proof that you looked at the document, but I don't necessarily need you to just copy and paste quotes from the document. But look at the document to come up with your answer. Any questions?